So we're starting here at the control versus the burn only. Anybody have any observations that you'd like to throw out there? Start off our discussion about these plots. What's up?
I said they don't look that different.
They don't look that different. No, that's a very important observation. So what in particular doesn't look that different about them?
Palmetto height?
Palmetto density.
Palmetto height, right? So we are quite surprised that the palmetto responded as quickly as it did. So we've got overall other shrub height and palmetto height is slightly lower here, but really not much lower at all. And you can see that listed here in the green versus the red on page 2. Percent cover, though, is significantly still reduced in the burned area. So one thing that we notice, even if the height is a pretty good recovery within 6 months' time, we still have significantly lower percent cover, about 50% of what we have in the control area. Some might consider that fast recovery, some might consider that relatively slow. If you look down at the litter and duff depths and mass graph, so that's also at the bottom of page 2, you can see we don't have all that much difference in terms of the duff depth. So we have a pretty significant reduction in litter depth, and we have significant reduction in litter mass. So those are sort of things that we're going for in terms of reducing potential fire behavior, potentially.
This piece of property, is it being managed for a specific thing? Timber, wildlife?
Well, I think it's probably the correct answer that it's being managed for all of those things.
Okay. So there's not one.
Wildlife habitat, all of the ecological services that it provides. These exact units are not going to be timber sale, but other areas that are similar to this are. And maybe somebody from the Osceola could elaborate on that.
Yeah, we're trying to maintain these big pine stands at about a 40 to 60 base layer, primarily for woodpecker introduction.
The RCW guidelines are, a major driver of management in this forest.
Did everybody hear that? That RCWs are a major driver of management?
What kind of growth do you get out of these stands?
Growth of trees?
Yeah.
Pretty much all these trees, back in the 30s, this whole forest was pretty much clear cut. So we probably got, these big trees are probably 70 years old right now. So,
In terms of percentage, what kind of growth do you get on an annual basis?
I really don't know.
Less than 2?
Their forester's not out here
Yeah.
today.
We'll be able to tell you
I don't-
as well. So we've been
I don't
taking
think we
data
have
from
much
that.
in the mature stands. It's very slow.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do have increment cores, so we're taking annual increment growth data as well, but I don't have that data with us today.
So is it the woodpeckers then that are dictating the seasonality of your burns?
No, what we're trying to do, I don't want to take too much time, we can talk about this offline a little bit, but we use an ecological condition model that kind of compares the current condition of the land to the relative to the desired future condition, and we have tiers of ecological condition. This would be what we call a tier 4 area, which is really bad. This would be like a tier 3, which is a transitional thing. It's not going to get any better. If you ignore it, it'll get worse, but it's not going to get any better unless you do something different to it, which means either more frequent fire than what you've been doing instead of a 3 to 5 year, or some other mechanical treatment, perhaps roller chopping and fire. And so it's all about trying to shift, 47% of this forest is in poor ecological condition. And so we're trying to shift that to a higher percentage, and we've got a lot of things in place in the last year or two. So that's one of the reasons why Scott's here now. He's heading up a big project going to double the timber harvest. Double the burn acreage and almost triple the timber harvest and do a bunch of other restoration work.
Mm-hmm. If it's 70 years old, it's getting old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the woodpecker population is pretty easy to manage here. You don't have a hardwood component that interferes with that. We've doubled the population. When I got here in 2003 in National Forest, Florida, we had 77 groups. Now we've got over like 143 groups, I think. So it's pretty easy to manage if you use artificial cavities. The trees are starting to get old enough that they're starting to excavate some of their own cavities, but
Great, that's really good context. Thanks, Carl.
Just a quick question. I'm sorry. You probably mentioned this already, but as we're looking at all these research plots, my impression is that again, what this research is trying to do is look at ways to reduce the intensity of fire behavior on just a generalized basis. Is that how we should be thinking about it?
Well,
As the basis of the research, or I mean,
I would say that we're looking to see what treatments do reduce fire behavior, or looking to see what the effects of treatments are on fire behavior.
okay,
The management objective is ultimately to reduce fire behavior
Okay.
variables and to reduce, crown scorch and mortality of overstory trees. So
Okay.
that would be the management perspective, and the science perspective is really, just to find out what exactly is happening.
gotcha. Thank you.
Really trying to facilitate the reintroduction of prescribed fire, because the forest had a target of only like 20,000 acres. It's 232,000 acre forest. Burning 20,000 acres is not going to get you anywhere a year pretty fast. So we really need to increase the burn acreage, but we have a lot of this to deal with.
So you want to increase the burn acreage, but you also want to reduce the amount of the intensity and the
Mortality.
mortality. And stuff.
Make it so that it's not all hands on deck, trying to keep the fire, from leaving an 11-year rough into a 15-year rough next to it.
Okay, gotcha.
Is this typical of what you see for 11-year rough?
I've seen a lot worse.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Thanks.
That's pretty good. I mean, it's bad. Yeah, I mean, it's not great.
And there's
but that's-
stuff where,
Yeah.
it's way over your
That's
head.
what I was
A
expecting.
lot of woody shrubs above besides the palmetto here. So.
Yeah. Yeah, when you said 11 to 20 years off, I wasn't.
Depends on the site. Some sites are more productive than others.
Yeah, it seems like in the aerial compartment, the rough is a little bit higher. So we have some data from that as well, showing the differences. Definitely site dependent. Some other basic differences that we saw between the control and the burn: a higher amount of bare ground exposed still after 6 months, and a higher grass component and a lower shrub component when we looked at the understory, under 0.5 meters in height. So for people who are concerned about things like understory restoration and wildlife habitat, we definitely saw more grasses in the burn site than in the control site. So we're seeing a little bit of an effect there. Okay, so let's look at what this looked like immediately following the treatment. So if you flip to page 5, we're going to talk a little bit now about the photo guide, and I'll let Jesse start with that.
Okay, so like Lita said, we're now transitioning to what these sites look like relatively shortly after the treatments were implemented, so within about a month. Okay, beyond mowing. The mowing was again conducted about a year ago, so these photos and the data reflect about a month or so after that treatment. And then burns were implemented at the end of February of this year. And so those data and those photos would reflect within about a month following that, to look at how those treatments largely influence potential fire behavior. Okay, and so that's what these photo series are generally used for. For those of you who aren't that familiar with them, these generally give you kind of an image. You have a picture, they're kind of user-friendly. Does this look like what I have? Okay, and then it has some pertinent fuel information that's important for modeling fire behavior. So in the right where it talks about fuel loading, most of you are probably familiar with the time lag classes for which we categorize woody material. If you're not, you can see under the treatments there, 1H, 10H, that's 1 hour, 10 hour, 100 hour fuels. If you're not familiar with those, that just refers to the size classes of the woody material on the ground. So a 1 hour fuel would be less than a 1/4 inch in diameter, and a 10-hour fuel would be 1/4 to 1 inch in diameter. Okay, so then we give pertinent loading information, and then we have some potential fire rate of spread and flame lengths from behave fire modeling, which is a pretty common computer model to model and predict both rate of spread and flame lengths and some other components like that. So some of the fire folks here are probably pretty familiar with that. And so essentially, if we look at these photo series, the first one here is the control with which we're standing in, and then the very next one is the burn only. So we can, if you want to kind of compare, first of all look at the burn only, and you can see that primarily when we burned this, the shrubs were gone and the litter was gone. We had high consumption. We don't have that data in here, but we had very high consumption in the litter, some consumption in the duff. Again, this photo was taken about a month later, so you can see shrubs starting to respond. You can see some needle cast in there, and that will reflect some of the fuel loading data that we have. Comparing it to the control, there was a reduction in those 1 hour, those little woody fuels. There was some increases in the 100 and 1,000 hours, and that can reflect, potentially when you're burning that maybe death in the overstory, that some of those branches, came down. You may have some of the dead branches on the shrubs that have burned that may come down. So sometimes we'll have a bit of an increase in fuel loading those larger diameter classes. So there's a little bit of an increase there.
And also there's been some observations that using brown planar intercept transects to assess fuels might lead to some errors in assessing those larger fuels after a burn, because oftentimes those larger fuels are embedded in the litter layer and you can't see them until after that litter is burned off. So when you go back and resample, you'll be counting materials that might have been there before you burned, but you couldn't see them, so they weren't assessed or counted in that method. So there might be a little bit of a methodology effect on that result as well.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. Because if there's litter, we'll often assume that if a large log is embedded in that, it's primarily not going to drive fire behavior. But like you said, if that litter is exposed, now that may be there for sampling. So correct, there may be some sampling issues in there. But I think the largest thing to point out is there's a substantial reduction in litter, some reduction in duff, and of course a reduction in shrub and palmetto cover. And so we have some predictions on the bottom here of rate of spread and flame lengths. And if you were to compare just by the photo guide, the axes are actually different. So you'd have to pay attention to the axes of how the predicted fire behavior would have been influenced. But
And you could
Why are they different scales?
Since we usually use a photo series, if we just have one graph of the same axes for everything, certain treatments that may have very little bit are going to have very low.
Oh, okay.
But so it's hard to compare.
Well, that's why I'm having them
Yeah.
side by side, and you
Yep.
can't really do that.
It's very hard. So what we did
But we do have
on
that's a good
page
question.
9.
We do have a side by side.
Oh,
Very good lead-in question.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks, Terry.
In page 9, these are the potential fire behavior predictions immediately post-treatment. So this is based on those fuels data that we have there.
But you can see if you look at those photo series numbers that flame lengths are about 3 times as high in the control than in the burn. And that's 1 month following the burn.
That intuitively makes sense. If you burn all this and consume most of it within the next month, you're probably not going to have much of a hazard if the fire burns through there again in terms of rate of spread or flame lengths. Now we'll talk about recovery and how that may make a difference.
I had a quick question with the
Yep.
fuel loading
Yep.
chart. You have 1,000 hours S and R.
Great question. So 1,000 hours S is a solid fuel and R means rotten. Okay, so a basic kick test. Okay, so that
Very sophisticated kick test.
very sophisticated, yeah.
If you kick it and it falls apart, we call it rotten.
Yeah.
Otherwise it's sound.
You gotta have a good pair of white's boots on to be able to do it right. But that's a
And
good point, because a solid material versus a rotten material, just in terms of estimating fuel loads, because we use equations to estimate fuel load, that rotten material or the same volume is going to result in a lower fuel load.
Because you're basing these hours of burn on just its diameter alone.
So these aren't, the hours are kind of misleading. They don't actually mean hours that the fuel will burn. It's an hour, it's the amount of time that it would take for the fuel to reach a certain percentage of the difference between ambient moisture content and the moisture content of the fuel. I know that's a very complicated explanation, but it's true. It's misleading. So the 1 hour fuels doesn't actually mean that fuel is going to burn for an hour. It means that it'll take an hour for that fuel to equilibrate with ambient moisture content. Yeah. So all of those fuels in that class, the smaller fuels, are going to respond to changes in relative humidity much faster than a 1,000-hour fuel would. Wow. So those 1,000-hour fuels, they're up to, as many inches in diameter, above 3 inches in diameter, and because of that surface area to volume difference, they're not going to change in moisture content
Yeah.
as quickly as the 1 hour.
And the smaller diameter fuels are usually more important in these algorithms in predicting fire behavior too, and that makes sense. They dry faster, they're going to transfer heat faster too, and so that's kind of the reasoning, but it is very kind of a confusing concept. Of course, smaller diameter stuff is going to dry out faster. If you have a change in weather conditions, those are going to be important to watch.
And in terms of lingering smoldering combustion that everybody's concerned about in terms of smoke effects, having more 1,000-hour fuels that are relatively dry could lead to problems. So it's more important in terms of longer-term smoldering combustion, smoke creation. It's not actually part of what's used in the equation to predict fire spread or to even predict flame lengths.
And a quick note for those of you that do use Behave or other means of modeling the fire behavior for the treatments where we do have a substantial shrub component in this gallberry palmetto. We've used the Puffin Albini special case fuel model for gallberry and palmetto to predict these. But in the post-burn treatments immediately, we've basically used the fuel model 9. If you're familiar with those, it's basically a litter model because that litter cast that's come down is primarily going to be what's driving fire behavior. There's all sorts of caveats to this modeling stuff that the fire folks get really interested in discussing too. Yeah. So those are all really good good questions about that.
So on page 9, where you have the yellow line for the predicted rates for mowing, is that if you were to burn it right after you mowed it?
1 month after.
Okay, so you didn't actually burn it because that's your control, that's your other category.
We do have a Mow+burn.
Right, but that's a separate category, so you never actually burn that. That's just what the Behave predicts for.
That's right.
Correct, and that's why it's a bit confusing. We'll talk about some of the observed fire behavior later, as I've noted on there. That obviously the control and mow, you know, prior to burning, half of those were burned and became the Mow+burn and burn only treatments. But our observed, you know, we're wanting to compare the observed burned in what would have been a control and burned in what would have been a mow. I think that's what you're essentially getting at.
So those observed values are from burning this.
Right.
But our controls weren't burned, so that's why it's a little confusing.
Right.
But bottom line take-home message, looking at the green line versus the red line, higher rate of spread predicted, higher flame lengths predicted, and that is immediately post-fire. Now turn to page 10 and see what it looks like in present day in terms of these predictions. We have virtually no difference in terms of rate of spread and just a slight difference in terms of predicted flame length. So we're already seeing the effects of the recovery of the vegetation here and how that affects potential fire behavior.
It's certainly an important question regarding, you know, okay, are these treatments effective at least at mitigating fire hazard? Okay, well, a month later, but how long is that window that you're getting that, you know, that reduction?
That benefit.
That's right, getting that benefit. And when you all talk about whether this is good or bad, or we should do it or not, weighing those costs and benefits against your objectives can be really important. And longevity, especially in the southeast, Lita and I both had worked in mastication work out west, where things were very different. You know, we would have heavy shrubs, manzanita that was masticated in younger trees, and we would end up with a heavy fuel load of largely woody material. It looked like someone just chipped up a bunch of wood and spread it out. And a year later, it didn't look much different.
Yeah.
Maybe one sprig of grass.
Yeah.
That's it.
So when I came here, I'm like, well, we're going to mow this stuff down, and I was new to this system, and I come out a week later, and the stuff's coming back. I'm like, oh boy, this is, you know, it started getting me really thinking about the longevity of effectiveness. And we'll talk about more when we get to the mowed and the Mow+burn too, and then kind of compare. But this is kind of the, you know, this is what you got in a lot of these areas, and what if we just burn it? You know, what if we don't utilize mechanical treatments? Okay, we just, you know, put fire on the ground and do it in that manner. This is kind of what we're getting, at least what we're seeing here.
So our take-home message from this site is site number 1, and the associated message is message number 1. So if you want to refer to that, like we said, burning mitigates potential fire behavior immediately post-treatment, but at 6 months post-burn, fuels and vegetation recovered, so that potential rate of spread was virtually not different between the treatments. Okay, and we've got to keep moving, so we'll head over to the next site. So, anybody want to guess what treatment we have over here? According to your color coding? Mow, right? So we're seeing mow treatment on your left, and again control. I'm sorry, mow treatment on your right, and control on your left. And if you look at some things that are kind of evident by looking, what do you guys see in terms of shrub cover in the mowed area?
Been reduced.
Okay. Yeah, certainly height is still lower 6 months later. Percent cover is still lower 6 months later.
A year later.
I'm sorry, a year later, thank you. What about composition?
Looks like more grass.
Grass. More herbaceous.
Yeah, so this was actually one of the key things that surprised me was that this, in the mow plots, it's the only plot where we had a significant percentage of the understory cover comprised of herbaceous species. So for people interested in understory diversity, mowing seems to have some positive effects. So we have more grass, first of all. We have this herbaceous component that we see in no other treatments, and we have much less of a shrub cover. And this is a whole year following the treatments.
Was there a seasonal influence on that? Seasonal.
That's a really good question. So this was mowed about a year ago. So it was mowed at coming to the end of the growing season. So we think that there is probably a seasonal effect, but we wanted to open that up for discussion. What do you guys think? If this had been mowed in the winter, would we expect to see different results? It was mowed
About a year, but at the end of August, I think. Basically towards the end of summer.
Well, besides the seasonal thing, there's also the influence of the drought too. So it's coming into a growing season when it should be growing, but it's not getting a lot of moisture, not getting a lot of rain.
Okay.
And so I'm sure that had a double whammy to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that might have prevented some of the shrub recovery and might have allowed for the ruderal species, the fast-growing species with prolific seed dispersal to occupy those sites. We also have seen, especially in the areas that you're looking at right over here, evidence of some soil disturbance. So those tractors certainly kick up some soil, and what they essentially end up doing is creating growing space for these ruderal species, and probably chopping up some of the rhizomes of the shrubs, so that the shrub recovery again is reduced and the growing space is made more available for the ruderal species. Now, how long this effect is going to last, we're not sure, and whether or not this will continue to look this way 3 or 4 years from now if it isn't mulched again is a question that we hope to answer.
It'd be interesting to see the effects of the woody component, the disturbance, the seasonality disturbing it. Other than fire, during season fire has a better effect on hardwoods. So kind of the surrogate to fire effect would be interesting to see.
Yeah, I totally agree. And palmetto cover is certainly quite different just following mowing. You compare just palmetto cover 70% versus about 30%. It's a pretty significant difference. And like Lita alluded to, are these rhizomes getting, affected or damaged with the actual, mechanical equipment out here? And so those who may be interested in how much of the shrub component is palmetto, maybe from a fire perspective or other perspective, that might be of interest too.
One other factor might be the physical, or I guess you maybe even say the height of the palmetto, how high that meristem is above the ground surface. The meristem higher up is more susceptible to being cut off, whereas one that's really low to the ground may not even be.
Right, and maybe thinking about whether you're in a music site or wetter site, how high those rhizomes are,
right,
based on moisture regime, that might be influence.
Yeah, and how old the site is, or when it was previously converted would also affect that. Troy?
How about invasive species in here?
We have not documented any invasive species in any of these units that we're going to see today. The only place that we've seen invasive species in our plots is in the buffer zone. So that was that long linear buffer that goes right up to people's backyards in Lake City. And that's where we've seen Japanese climbing fern. But that's the only one that we've documented. Is that right, Mike?
There's more.
Tallow.
Oh, we got Chinese tallow.
But you
yes,
get bassy
it's a lot.
grass and some of the other grasses? Because it seems like anytime we hire contractor to do anything, or we do a logging job, all of a sudden bassy grass will pop up in the areas where because they're picking it up on the roads.
Yeah, torpedo grass is a problem out here. I mean,
We were
there's
talking
some
about
other
that.
species, but they're pretty minimal. This forest is very fortunate compared to the other two that I'm responsible for. We've got a lot more non-native invasive species issues on the Ocala and Apalachicola than we have on Osceola.
We certainly haven't seen any in our plots anyhow, in interior at least, but adjacent to, you know, the interface or private timber or something, that might be the places where it is susceptible, and we certainly want to take a look at that, which is why we have those boundary plots. I think that's more of a, but if you see any out here on the tour today, make sure you point them out.
Yeah, and I think it might be more of an issue on the Ocala because there's probably more off-road vehicle usage than there is here.
Did you guys look at the effect of the mulch, possibly? If you, and I'm not, you know, without seeing it after the mowing, I'm trying to picture how thick that mulch layer was, and if that would possibly, you know, suppress, you know, the regrowth of some of those species.
It could, and I don't think we have anything direct right now to really substantiate that that's a cause. Although we do have some indication, I'm still looking at this, of some soil nutrient data that we have, and just early on we're showing mowing has some reduction in nutrient status, whether that may have an influence. But actually having that mulch material there, like you said, may be an issue. I noticed out west we certainly thought about that, where you have a heavy woody mulch on the ground, and how much is that going to influence things from recovering and coming up through there.
So in that case, we would expect that the shrubs would better recover than some of the other potential inhabitants that require things like bare mineral soil.
Oh, right, right.
Yeah, so we're seeing at least, and in my opinion, I think it's because of some of the mech damage to the soil that we're seeing enough open soil for those graminoids to be successful and for the herbaceous species to be successful. So maybe there's a combined effect, you know, a mulching effect suppressing regrowth in some areas, but also an exposition of the bare mineral soil, creating new growing sites for the little seeds.
And the reason I ask is we've done a lot of roller chopping on our properties, and one thing I've noticed, and again, you know, it's just subjective, just drive by, sort of notice on some areas that have been chopped and that were not burned, we've actually gotten quite a bit of suppression in shrub regrowth, you know, gallberry, you know, some of the other woodier stuff as well. And again, you know, I've no data or anything on it, just you know, drive-by window survey. So.
And are you seeing a difference in composition too, like the
I
response
didn't
that we're
really
seeing
pay
here?
much attention to composition, other than just, you know, looking at structure. You know, driving by and say, wow, it's, you know, you don't
It's
have
more
it.
open.
Yeah, it's more open, and so.
Yeah.
You mentioned the palmetto density, about 30% cover here versus like 70% over here, and that's another driving factor to management. Work that Tall Timbers has done and revealed that basically when the palmetto coverage gets above 30%, you start losing your grassland birds, you know, your Bachman sparrows, your bobwhite quail, loggerhead shrikes, other species just basically just disappear. And so another driver for our management is to get that palmetto density down to 30% or less. And so that's what a lot of our management's geared to doing.
Yeah, that's a great link specifically to wildlife habitat and what we know about wildlife that we certainly care about. And even a year later, it seems to be effective in creating better habitat for them.
Like I said, if we do, you know, continue to monitor, and let's say this was retreated with mowing without any burning, thinking about, you know, long-term influences. If you're continuing to add more mulch to it every 5 years, every however long, and how is that influencing the system versus if you're burning and getting rid of that every few years.
Any bold char over here on your left. Would you have guessed that? And why?
A lot less palmetto density. Took it down and the fire took it down more.
Okay, so actually, in this case, we have, in our measurements anyways, we have more palmetto cover here and less other shrub cover, mostly gallberry, and here we have a little bit more gallberry and a little bit less palmetto. But in terms of the height, as you're looking across, pretty similar.
What's grassy?
Yeah, certainly we did not see the herbaceous component in the Mow+burn, and we saw significantly less grass component. So this is charted on page 3. So in terms of that structural diversity, when they're looking at Mow+burn versus mow, again, we're seeing a pretty big difference there.
Lead on the fuel loading chart, what is the shrub H-A?
Oh, that just means the shrub biomass was calculated using an equation from Huff and Albini's model.
Okay.
Because we wanted to get the recent measurements, and those equations are largely based on how much palmetto is there, really. So that's a good question. I meant to bring that up.
Do you attribute the difference in grass between, or do you have something to attribute it to, but between the mow and burn and the mow? Could it be season of burn affecting young grass seedlings or something? Or that's something else in mind, but I can't think of what it is off the top of my head. But did you have any ideas on? I mean, intuitively you would think that the mow and burn would have more grasses and
Right.
and herbs and such, but that's not the case.
Right, and I think that's a very, very good point. This was burned in the winter season, so we're probably not going to get the same response that we would get if we had burned it in the growing season. So there, I think, is definitely a seasonal effect. And we do have some data showing growing season burn effects as well, but we don't have that here.
Are you basing all of this, do you have anything that looks at like changes? Like, you're looking at the actual components now and percentages, but is there anything that looks at the change? Like, did you look at them beforehand and say, well, it was this cover before? Because that's,
Yes.
I mean, I know these sites are very, very similar, but when it's not, it'd be better to look at the changes than,
Yeah,
Like
because you want to know
pre versus
you want to
post.
know where you're going, not.
Yep, and we have a large, when Lee had pointed out that large aerial mowed unit and the buffers, and the larger aerial mowed unit should give us a better representation of what's out there regarding, heterogeneity and all this stuff, because it's a much larger area. And there we certainly have pre and post, and we're looking at pre-post and then what's happening over time.
Because like as a manager, I'm really more interested, not that there's more grass there than there, but like, well, is there more grass here than what was before the treatments, or like, because I want to know how I'm going to get to my desired conditions.
Right.
And
So that would be, comparing this with the control would get at that question as well. And in order to make sure that we're not making a false assumption that the control is representative of what was here beforehand, we do have pre-treatment data as well, and we use that to in our statistical analyses to make sure that we're.
And the way you set it up, it's pretty obvious they're pretty similar sites because they're in the same block.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's always a
always
a good point, that there's assumptions made, and then our larger study incorporating these different experimental designs and a little more in situ studies over there, I think we'll be able to look at that as this representing the changes. And largely what I've seen so far on the changes over there, it's reflecting what we see here, although we do have the season of burn issue here, and we weren't able to burn as much in that larger unit as we had hoped. So.
Those different season burn data, are those available?
They are not published yet. Yeah. Jesse's working really hard, but hasn't gotten around to that yet.
No pressure.
Got a year to finish his dissertation.
Hopefully it'll come out. And it'll take 3 years to get that done, so it'll
Oh,
be
no, it
accepted. That's what's so great about the Southern Fire Exchange. It's a way of transferring information from science to managers, and I see it as a real conjunction you know, what y'all are seeing on the ground and what you're doing and what we can kind of add just from a scientific perspective, because we have all sorts of caveats, and putting that all together I think is important to look at when making management decisions. So.
In your collection of soil temperature, did that temperature reading occur during a burn? The other thing I was wondering is the effect of that kind of more compressed horizontal fuel bed right on the soil potentially impacting the seed bank, or is that
Right.
maybe the difference between the mow and the burn?
And we don't have that data from burning here, but that's one of the reasons that we set up those experimental plots in the Austin Carey Forest, so that we could actually thermocouple the soil at different depths and see what the longevity of the heat pulse was and how long that temperature was above 60 degrees Celsius, which would presumably lead to seed death and fine root death.
And in those experiments, you know, when we had burned at some low fuel moistures, we had very little response in the soil. We had some, but we just used the masticated litter as we collected, and there was no duff in that.
Right.
Duff may be the important component because you're going to have duff in a long unburned system, and is burning that mulch material enough of a heat pulse with a long enough residency time to maybe to get that duff going too, and then that duff might be impacting fine roots and stuff in the system, the seeds too. So I think that's an important question, and our environmental instruments we have out here don't allow us to burn it and keep them there without losing the instruments. So.
Sure.
And the difference in terms of our duff depth in the mode versus the control is not actually significant. And the litter mass depth is not very great in terms of the difference as well. So I'm not sure that there would be that much of an effect, except for, because of the compaction, some increased longevity or increased duration of burning.
Right.
And we do have soil temperature data that's associated with the respiration study. And David will be talking about that at the end, so he can probably add his 2 cents to your question.
Okay. Thank you.
And again, there's a photo guide developed on page 8 for the Mow+burn. And again, this was within a month after treatment.
So within a month after treatment, you see basically all fuel loads reduced, as would be expected, and potential fire behavior reduced as well.
And the Mow+burn and the mow weren't taken on the exact same day, but if you look at the 2 pictures and the data, we're seeing a little less of that shrub response, and there's less needle cast on the ground, which we'll talk about in the next site when we talk about potential effects to the overstory of burning units.
So looking further, page 10, again looking at potential fire behavior if these were burned in their present day conditions. Again, relatively no difference with rate of spread, and still a little bit of improvement in comparison with the control, but not a really big difference between these 2 sites in terms of flame lengths produced. Do you want to mention the observed versus?
Yeah, and should we mention that when we get over to the burn sites? Or?
Okay.
Okay, I think that would.
All right. Any further questions about this site? Okay. By now with our color coding. So what have we got here on your right?
Burn.
Burn only, and on the left?
Mow+burn.
Mow+burn. All right. Basic observations about some differences. How about palmetto cover?
Very similar.
Higher palmetto cover in the burn.
Higher palmetto cover in the burn, right? What about shrub height? Higher in the burn again, and remember, this is a year past mowing, 6 months past burning, just 6 months past burning. That's the kind of difference in response. In terms of our species composition, in the mow versus Mow+burn, we have a very slight reduction in grass component, So it looks like, and that's in contrast to the mow conditions. So going from mowing to mowing plus burning seems to have reduced our grass component and done away with our herbaceous component.
And again, we kind of mentioned the whole seasonality thing. That's something we can really generalize, you know, might be a different story because of the seasonal differences.
On to the photo guide.
Yeah. So, in the photo guide, essentially if we were to look at Mow+burn on page 8, and comparing it to the burn only, there's a little more 1 hour fuels, less 100 and 1,000 hours, so a little less of the larger wood that may have been there, so that may reflect the stuff that was there following mowing had been consumed during burning. As Lee had mentioned, differences in shrub and how that might influence fire behavior, because this is within a month following treatment and not what we're seeing now. But
so within a month following treatment, we saw very little difference and virtually no difference in predicted fire behavior.
There's a little less litter, somewhat less litter in the Mow+burn treatment versus the burning treatment within a month following burning. Okay.
So can anybody guess by looking at these two units what you think might be responsible for a little bit higher litter?
Type of needles coming down? Not the type, the size?
Like size of an individual
Long leaf
needle?
per slash?
So species difference maybe?
Or maybe the
So it's
amount of crown scorch, potentially?
Yeah, it's likely the species isn't a difference, but why would there potentially be more litter that fell on the burn-only site?
Because the higher flame, it's more crown scorch.
More crowns.
Yeah.
More needle drop.
Very nice. Okay. So the effects that the fire may have had, and we have some data to discuss on that, is going to in turn influence what kind of fuel conditions are following the treatment. Okay?
You look at the height of the char marks.
Now look at the height of the char. I mean, just coming in here and walking in here without looking at data, you could look at char height to kind of get an estimate of how fire behavior differed between them. But what about scorch?
And you might want to look kind of behind you, back towards Leland here, for one of the patches that we had.
Yeah.
So there's some mortality on the burn side.
And a really neat thing that that Mike and Dawn found, this is another great example of how Google is awesome. It turns out that there was a photo taken, the Google Earth photo was taken just a couple of weeks after these were burned. So if you look back to page 1, you can see right now we are standing at location number 4. And if you orient your book like this, what you're looking at between 1 and 4 is the burn only, and on the other side is the Mow+burn. So immediate effects on crown scorch are even evident in these photos. You can see a lot greater percent of crowns that are scorched in the burn only versus the Mow+burn units. And you can see the other treatments. So you kind of imagine these blocks being moved down. You can see what the mow treatment looks like, what the Mow+burn treatment looks like, what the burn only treatment looks like, and how those all look like or differ from the control treatment. So we thought that that was a really good find.
Yeah, and we don't have to pay to do a flyover to get the photo either. But is that what we're seeing now? I mean, can you see that there's obviously, it looks like less overstory canopy cover in the burn only. I see some mortality over here.
Yeah.
Is that largely what we're seeing?
For those of you who have a lot of experience with how amazing southern pine are at recovering from crown scorch, seeing that amount of crown scorch, would you expect to see a whole lot of mortality? And again, this was a dormant season burn. Yeah, probably not in February. Now what if that was, the burn was done in the growing season?
Depends on how early.
Depending on moisture.
Yeah.
Okay, lots of it depends for sure.
August it'd be bad. It'd be doing in April and May and nothing dies.
Yeah. So early growing season might have seen less. Later growing season might have seen more mortality. And we have, on page 11, we chronicle some of this crown damage comparing the burn only and the Mow+burn. And a couple of the things that we noticed, there is a strong relationship between the diameter of the trees and their percent crown scorch in the burn only, but that relationship is not very strong in the Mow+burn. We're not exactly sure why that's the case. That's something that we have a number of plausible explanations for. If any of you have insights into why that might be the case, we'd like to have you share them with us. We did see in the Mow+burn that more larger trees were scorched in comparison to the burn only. So in the burn only you can see that a lot of the smaller trees had 100% crown scorch, whereas in the Mow+burn, even the smaller trees in some cases had very little crown scorch. And even the larger trees had significant amounts of crown scorch. So a real difference in terms of pattern there that we think is affected by the difference in the fuels. In terms of number of, go ahead.
What was the humidity, relative humidity and wind speed the day of the burn? Do you have that? It was roughly about 3 kilometers per hour of wind. It wasn't very much. Our litter fuel moisture was about 12 to 14%, and our live fuel moisture ranged between about 100 and 120%. And I actually had some difference between the treatments as far as live fuel moisture. We actually had a little less in the burn versus the Mow+burn. For a late February burn, I think it was pretty dry. I mean, we were in a La Nina year. It was pretty dry. I think we were in the mid 70s. I think when we burned this, because we burned these about noon, and I think our RHs was at 47. So it gives you some indication of what the conditions were like when we were burning when trying to compare season. Because in season we may have, well, maybe differences in litter and fuel moisture, maybe differences in moisture, but also we have the, the stage which the trees are in. If we're talking about lower story tree mortality, is there buds to flush out if you scorch 100% of a tree? If there's no buds to flush out, then there's maybe not going to be a response. But so I think I think generally speaking, for a late February burn, it burned pretty well. It was relatively dry, but they came back. Now, thinking about synergistic effects, if beetles could potentially be an issue, we seem to see a couple trees in here that looks like we may be starting to have some beetle infestation.
Or the beetles tried and didn't stay, but we definitely have beetle hits in the burn only, and we haven't seen any in the Mow+burn. Even they're in such close proximity together, and they were burned at the same time. That was another really interesting result.
From a researcher thinking about, what are the different ways that a tree can die during a fire? Well, of course, there can be overstory damage through, needle scorch or needle consumption, but there's also damage to fine roots and potential cambial damage if the fire is hot enough. But the rate of spread that the fire is moving is probably a major issue. Down here in the southeast, fires can be very intense, but they'll move very quickly, and a lot of the heat is up in this vertically oriented fuel, so that heat's not being pumped into the ground and the residency time isn't that long. One of our concerns is if we mulch this and mow it down, are we going to have a longer residency time of that heat pulse, and will that potentially influence root damage or bulb damage? From a researcher, I like to see death just so I can figure out what's causing the death. So if we were to say had a bunch of substantial mortality here and not here, regardless of the crown scorch, that may have been an issue, but it doesn't seem to be. But we did do some burns, not this last summer, but the summer before, in about July, where it was very hot in some mowed areas, and some of them were in young plantations, and it was for the sake of research, so we were going in there to burn to see what was going on, and we did get some heavy mortality that hasn't recovered. So there may be some seasonal issues to think about regarding potential
tree mortality. You know, whether that's the litter being able to ignite the duff, and maybe there was some damage to fine roots or to, you know, cambial damage that we don't at least think happened here, or whether it was something else, just the stage of the trees. I mean, in the middle of July, that's a whole different stage for a tree reproductively.
My research is focused on understanding how forest management practices in Florida are influencing soil carbon dynamics. And I have a portion of my research out here in the experimental units, and we're trying to understand how the different treatment regimes out here are influencing soil carbon and soil carbon respiration, so soil CO2 flux from the soils. So to address those questions, we've set up sampling plots, and you're standing adjacent to one of mine right here. In each of the treatments, we have a total of 12 plots out here, and in each sample plot we have 9 PVC collars. And you may be able to see here, we've got these PVC collars arrayed in each plot, and they're permanently installed in the soils following the treatment. We use the burning and the mowing. And those collars, each of these plots, are sampled once a month, twice a day, and during sampling we're taking measurements of soil CO2 respiration, and at the same time we're taking measurements of soil temperature and also soil measurement. So we have a pretty large data set. We started taking measurements back in December of 2010 and monthly since then, and we will continue on through the fall and the winter. And just to show you what we're working with here, this is called a LICOR, an LI8100, and it's an instrument that sits on top of these collars and seals on and measures that soil CO2 flux over a period of about 2 minutes. It has a data logger on there that at the same time is taking those soil temperature and soil moisture measurements. So some of the preliminary results that we've had out here, you can see a little bit there in your book. I think it's on page 13 or 14?
12 and 13.
12 and 13. So what we've looked at so far, looking at the soil component itself, we've not seen a significant difference in the treatments in terms of total carbon in the soil or organic matter. But those soil samples we're looking at, those were taken pre-burn. So some samples that will be taken this fall will be accounting for any treatment effect for burn on those soil. In terms of soil temperature, we've seen definitely a seasonal trend like you'd expect, warming through the winter months, through summer and into through spring and then summer. And there were definitely differences in terms of the soil's temperatures from treatments. So burning, as we saw, increased soil temperatures, and there was a burn effect on soil temperature both in the burn only and in the Mow+burn like we're seeing here. Mowing also increased the soil temperatures in the summertime, and it appeared to decrease soil temperatures in the wintertime. Looking at the soil moisture, and I believe you have a graph showing that one, there were significant differences between the treatments. The burning, in terms of soil moisture, it increased soil moisture over the study period. Mowing also increased the soil moisture even more so than burning did. So even in here in the Mow+burn, we saw an increase due to the mowing in terms of soil moisture over the study period. But I guess you'll see there in the graph that the treatment effects on soil moisture were fairly well lost during the drought. So once we hit spring and summer, our soil moisture values plummeted, as would be expected. And so during that period of time, there was pretty well indistinguishable the treatment effects on soil moisture during that time. So we'll look and see, we're going to continue the measurements, as I said, and we'll look and see if treatment effects reoccur either in the fall or the winter. So finally, the soil CO2 respiration, there were also significant differences between the treatments there. Burning in both the burn only and the Mow+burn, burning tended to decrease soil CO2 respiration. We saw less CO2 coming from the soils, and mowing showed, or mastication, showed no clear effect.
there was not a clear trend on soil carbon loss there. One of the interesting things to pay attention to, I guess, is with the soil respiration measurements is that soil CO2 respiration was generally followed a seasonal trend with the temperatures as well that we saw in the soils. And analysis there showed that about 32% of the variation in soil respiration was explained by that temperature measurement. So I think that's important to what we want to keep in mind. So I guess the take-home message here is that burning reduced our soil CO2 respiration. Mowing so far has not had a true effect that we've seen, but the mowing did alter those soil conditions of soil temperature and soil moisture, right? And what we know about there's two components of soil CO2 respiration. There's the autotrophic and there's the heterotrophic. Autotrophic is from the plants and heterotrophic is from soil microorganisms, right? And we know that these soil microorganisms generally respond, they metabolize more so during increased temperature and also within a boundary, but within increased soil moisture, right? So some of the questions that remain is if mowing or mulching, we're not seeing an initial effect on soil CO2 respiration, but by changing those soil conditions that tend to govern a component of soil CO2 respiration, we may see down the road changes in carbon dynamics because of those changed conditions. Does that make sense? And that was something Carl mentioned, the idea of baling. And so I think that's an interesting concept, because if we're putting down this mulch material and that mulch material appears to be changing soil conditions that might later down the line alter our carbon dynamics in the soil, if we're picking that up and taking it with us, those sites may actually tend to have similar treatment effects to just a burn site, because you don't have that mat remaining in the soil altering those soil conditions. I guess another flip side to that is if we're leaving this material on the ground, that stuff at some point is likely to become a labile carbon source for these heterotrophic soil microorganisms. And so we'll be curious to see over time if we see a spike in respiration due to that labile carbon addition. And there's some studies in other systems that it's called a priming effect, where you have an addition of labile carbon into a system, and that can kind of push it up to a next notch, where all of a sudden those microorganisms that were in the soil were hanging out happy at a current level of carbon inputs. You add a whole bunch more through some either anthropogenic event like mastication or some kind of stochastic natural event, but that addition of carbon can pump them up to a whole nother level of activity, and you can have real dramatic changes in soil dynamics. So those are really the big take-home messages, I guess. And just to kind of give you an idea of why we'd be interested in changing those soil temperature conditions, you hear people talk about global climate change and warming in boreal or Arctic forests or Arctic areas where they have these thick organic layers that have remained in very low temperatures, and there's a lot of organic material, and the heterotrophic decomposition of that material has been slowed for a very long time because it's cold. But as you warm up in those areas, we're starting to see dramatic releases of carbon from those soils. So it's not quite the same scale that we're looking at here, but it's something that we want to understand for future modeling, for understanding the consequences of mastication on soil carbon. So, any questions?
How long does the effect last after you burn of decreased soil respiration?
Well, we're still seeing it now. So we burned these plots in February, and we're still seeing a reduced treatment effect.
So if you scale that up, how does that compare to the carbon releases on a burn?
Oh, generally it's low, but when you start talking about scaling up, the idea is that we're only looking at the releases from the soil, right? So when you burn, there's also the vegetative regeneration, and so you're looking at over time. Usually, there's not a large change in that ecosystem productivity. It ends up being about the same. It's generally a sink in most systems, but not a huge source when you're burning in systems that are typically fire adaptive, so to speak.
Over time.
Yeah.
Mr. God,
Yes,
you used the term I'm not familiar with.
Okay.
Did you say labile?
Yeah, labile. So it's
Labile.
It's carbon that is in a state that's easily digested or easily accessible to soil microorganisms.
Okay.
So it's going to be generally quickly available to them over a short period of time. So in the other hand, they have what's called recalcitrant soil carbon, and that just means it's hard to get to, right? And so when people are looking at carbon sequestration in soils,
yes, sir,
they're talking about generally recalcitrant material that's going to be in the soil for hundreds or thousands of years. And what we're thinking here is this will probably be labile soil or labile carbon, meaning it'll probably turn over pretty quickly.
Thank you.
What would be an example of recalcitrant?
Recalcitrant?
Char,
It would
charcoal.
be, yeah,
Oh, okay, so
biochar or
it's
charcoal in the soil, black carbon, something like that. So.
And on your chart, what's the A and the AB and
Those are showing the, thank you. Those are the months where we had statistically significant differences between the treatments.
I mean on the above the colors.
So if the letters are the same, that means that there were no significant differences between the data below those letters. So if there's an A next to an A, then those two bars underneath were not different.
Not
if it's an A, and then a B, both of those bars differed from the B.
And the columns where we don't have letters, those are areas that, due to the variability in the data, there were not real differences between treatments. They are statistically indifferent.
Or like the month where the plots are burned also doesn't have letters, so like weird stuff was already going on,
Yeah.
so it's not.
The trends were not really clear then, so to speak.
And soil's really hard to work with for anybody who's worked with it. The spatial heterogeneity is so high. I mean, if this plot is over a tree root, then we get all of the CO2 that's being respired by that autotrophic source. If it's not over a tree root, we'll get much lower data. And we try to put enough sample points in that we account for that variability, but oftentimes in soil studies and soil respiration studies especially, it's very, very hard to capture some of those differences.
And there's a lot of variables that go into why you may or may not have high or low rates during different periods. And that's one of the reasons we sample in the morning when it's cooler, and then we sample again in the afternoon when it's warmer because of the temperature effect. And then there's seasonal trends, and that try to account for seasonal variations in rain precipitation or vegetative activity, tree response.
We've had some great questions and great discussions. We thought that we might just reiterate some of the take-home messages from each of the stops that we stopped at to refresh your memories and give you something to think about on the way home. Or just to keep playing.
This is here. Okay, just kind of the take-home messages on page 14. I'll just kind of go through the bottom ones. Okay, although burning either following warren alone mitigates potential fire behavior immediately, after treatment at 6 months, post-burn fuels and vegetation recovered so that potential rate of spread was no longer affected by treatment. Okay, again, getting back to that, is there a treatment effect? Yeah, but how long does it last? And I think here in the southeast, that's a pretty important question. Okay, flame lengths appear to be greatly reduced by all treatments when compared with controls, even after this recovery time period. Number 2, mowing increases percent cover of herbaceous and grassy species, increasing functional diversity and potentially improving wildlife habitat. Mechanical disturbance to soils may be responsible for these effects. As we talked about in the mowed areas, we did see higher, proportions of grasses and herbs, and that may have some benefits. But again, we looked at when we burned and the seasoning with which we burned, maybe that's having an effect. Okay, but that that mechanical disturbance to the soil may be one of those reasons, and we discussed some other potential mechanisms for that to be the case. Burning during the dormant season after mowing decreases herbaceous and grass components of the understory when compared with mow alone. Okay, that's self-explanatory. Mowing lawn and bird sites prior to reintroduction of fire reduces fire behavior, decreases crown scorch and tree mortality, and results in low fire risk. Okay, that's kind of a big take-home message regarding fire. Okay, and whether or not using mechanical treatments is an effective way of kind of knocking it down before you go at it with fire. And again, if it kind of gets to whether you want to knock it down just to reintroduce fire as your long-term management practice, or are you forced to have to maybe use these mechanical treatments because you're in the urban interface and smoke issues and all of that. But we found no evidence of increased bole or fine root damage in Mow+burn site. Basically, we had heavy scorch out here, but you've seen most of it came back. Although we had heavier scorch in the burned areas, and there's a little bit of mortality in there. We'll have to wait and see if the insects do anything. Okay, but remember, the caveat is when we burn this. We burned it in the winter. For those of you interested in discussing the whole seasonal effect, that's certainly a major caveat. And then the stuff that David had went over: soil carbon and soil organic matter are not affected in short term by the treatments. However, burning appears to decrease soil carbon loss and increase soil temperatures. And again, we'll see what the longevity of those treatment effects might be.
Just, I think a lot of it, intuitively, may be because of the palmetto response. If you, it seems like the palmetto is stimulated by the fire, and that's one of the reasons why we're seeing the higher diversity of grasses and herbs, maybe in the mow only, compared to the mow and the fire. And it may not be so much the mow as much as the fire stimulating the palmetto and the palmetto shading back out. What do you think about that possibility?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility. Although when we compare to control, we do see that there's a difference in the mowing response in herbaceous and grassy species. So if we didn't do anything, what we're starting with already is fewer grasses and fewer herbs.
Because of the well-established palmetto.
Yes, and well-established palmetto.
Right.
So it
yeah,
seems
exactly.
like the burning...
So what I'm saying is that it may not be so much that the mowing is reducing, or the mowing and the fire is reducing the grass because of the mowing is providing more open space. I think what it boils down to is just the palmetto is not responding. It's not flushing back up like it is in the fire.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, it's all about competition.
Right.
With what species are where and what the functional diversity looks like.
Yeah, so when you get that open space, the grasses and the herbs can respond to it.
Right.
And the palmetto is not stimulated. But when you do both and you burn, you're probably losing it because the palmetto is coming back with vigor, after it's fired.
Right, so it could be a stimulating effect, or it could be that palmetto was significantly damaged by the mastication.
Right.
So that it didn't have access to the underground carbon storage that it still had access to in the burn-only sites.
Right.
So I think maybe one or the other, or both of those, could be affecting that result.
Well, a logical extension of this research would be to look at what we're doing now, which is the light roller drum chopping, followed by fire, because it's been tested different places in the state where to really permanently reduce the palmetto coverage and density, if you light roller drum chop it and then you burn it within 6 months, regardless of time of year of fire, that seems to dramatically reduce the palmetto. This project was because of the ARA money that we had, and so we didn't do roller drum chopping. But now, since we got this other funding for this collaborative forest landscape restoration program, now we're doing a lot more of the chopping. So that would be a good extension of this project. And look at that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we got to get some plots in there. That's great. That'll be a great comparison too, because everybody's also interested in different types of mechanical treatments and their effectiveness. Great suggestion.
Another question. So early on we talked about the cost. It was $120 to $200 an acre for the mulching. Do you guys know how many acres they were able to do in an hour?
Does anybody know the rate?
Yeah, it depends. If it's a light mid-story, you're probably looking at maybe an acre an hour.
An acre an hour.
Yeah, if it's heavy fuels, something that's really dense, a lot of hardwood, you're probably looking at something on the low end, maybe a 1/4 acre an hour.
Okay. And those pecan heads are 8 foot?
It depends. Yeah, those smaller units I think are about 8 feet, but you can get the bigger units as well. Yeah, 12 feet or so.
Thank you. The other question was, as far as like stand density of the pine, you know, standing here looking at the stand, is this, you know, how are you guys, you know, as managers, is this the sort of stand density that you're looking for long term? And what, do you have any, you know, how do you, are you setting up your harvest guidelines? And what I'm getting at is, you know, again, we're talking about, you know, reducing mortality, you know, crown scorch mortality in trees is, you know, by thinning and doing some follow-up research that includes a thinning operation and burning. You know, is that conducive with, you know, overall stand management of where you all as you know, National Forest trying to, you know, get your stand to a certain, you know, density?
Yeah, I think that'd be a good question
Yeah.
for Carl.
Well, for us, it's, you know, we've got so many stands on this forest that are way overstocked, you know, 90, 100, 110 basal area plus. You know, we're trying to get them down in that range of 50 to 60. Ideally, you know, what we would like to do, and there could be some impact of losing needle cover if you go to 40 or 50 basal area, you know, and your ability to burn. Ideally, what we'd like to do would be to thin, roller drum chop, and then burn. And then we'd have it in a maintenance mode with fire from there on out. But, you know, when you're treating a forest the scale of what we got here, 232,000 acres, it's kind of, may not be practical to do that in every stand. So we'll have to see. On the Apalachicola Flatwoods, it's a major issue, converting slash pine stands to longleaf and losing the timber overstory
Pine fuels. Yeah.
greatly impedes your ability to burn when you don't have that needle cast. So you got to be real careful. But, you know, generally speaking, you know, we have ample opportunity to meet our timber target. You know, there's so many stands out here that are overstocked, and we're not worried about, you know, initial treatment and reducing longleaf regeneration or slash pine regeneration. Here on this forest, when we try to regenerate longleaf, if we don't burn, it looks like you've seeded it with slash pine. Right. All of our, you know, longleaf reforestation plots, you know, they're just full of slash pine because of the years of drought not being able to burn. And so, you know, we're just trying to get them in kind of an initial state and try to manage them, maintain them from there. So we're really shooting for that 50, 60 basal area, and want to take a lot of the revenue. We've got a project that we're working on right now that allows us to take the timber receipts from that and utilize it on our neighboring lands using the Wyden Amendment. So like the John Bethea State Forest and any of the industrial timberland folks that want to participate with us, we can actually take revenue from our timber stands because I don't need all that revenue. You know, basically when you thin a stand, all you need to do is burn it. And so we'll have a lot of excess revenue. We're actually trying to take that revenue and use it to help some of the folks next to us either do some kind of mechanical treatment followed by prescribed fire, or in the case of John Bethea State Forest, just trying to help them reforest. They hadn't even been able to reforest some of their longleaf sites after the bugaboo fire. So a lot of things going on here.
Yeah, I understand.
Great questions. Anybody else?
I had a question about the leaf litter here. Is this pretty typical for like after the fire? Because I'm looking around and there's no soil showing, or you know, looks like it's still fairly thick. And I guess some of the places that we burn at, it's a little drier, and you do get exposed sand, and you get more herbaceous response. So I didn't know if this was typical of here after the mowing, because there's still a lot that didn't burn. You can see it's not all after the burn.
I think this looks, there's more here, I think, than generally in some of other
I'm looking at it like I wouldn't want this much left. It's,
Right. And I think that kind of brings up some stuff that I was talking about with Sean Kinghorn this morning is, if you mow this stuff down and you have thick litter and then you want to burn it with the intent to consume that litter, under what conditions do you burn it so that you consume it but don't cause any other problems? And a lot of stuff we burn where the litter moisture has been relatively low, we've gotten pretty decent consumption. This rate in this particular spot looks relatively low. We had some stuff we burned last winter over in another unit, and basically just kind of went over the very surface of it, and that's it. And we didn't consume it, so we did all that work and didn't really get, what we were trying to get out of it.
Several fires.
So if you're actually trying to reduce that fuel load by following up by prescribed burning, what are those conditions under which
Right.
you
Usually
do it?
our target is to get more herbaceous, and with that thick, it's not going to happen much.
Yeah, and if that mulch then, can potentially hold more moisture, especially in time periods where you do have rain, but maybe there would be a window in between to burn, maybe it's going to hold too much moisture versus what you'd normally have just with the litter cast.
That's the other thing to keep in mind too with this Flatwoods forest. This is really probably drier February than it's ever been. I mean, typically working out here on this forest, just as recent as a few years ago, any of these low spots would have water in it, probably in February and January. Coming out here in the fall and working with woodpeckers with Dave Dorman over there, I mean, we were sloshing around in water all over the place all the time. And you look at any low depression will have some type of moss growing in it, And so, what you get this February, who knows? If it stays this dry, you might not even have been able to burn some of these places in February if it would have been just 5 or 6 years ago. So.
Yeah, and I think that really highlights the importance of doing long-term research, because so often research is really just driven by available funding, and then it ends when the funding ends. But I think that our collaboration here has been so successful that we'll figure out a way to continue this and make sure that we track these changes over time, because these results are absolutely influenced by the current conditions in which we're measuring them and the conditions prior to the burn and following the burn. So we need to take those things into account. And the only way we can do that is with longer term research. So I think it's very important.
Are you guys looking at replicating this study anywhere?
You mean in other forests?
Yeah.
We would love to, but again, it's the funding issue. We would need to have a significant additional grant in order to be able to do that. I mean, we're certainly interested. We'd like to be able to do that, but it would take the ability to hire more graduate students, et cetera, more field technicians. But there's also the potential for, through C4, for example, pooling resources amongst different agencies and applying those resources towards addressing these kinds of questions across numerous locations and using some of the existing manpower that already is in those other locations. So I think C4 serves as a really good conduit for getting that kind of research done that covers a broader array of vegetation types, a broader geographic area, but addresses some of the same questions. So that might be something that we work on through C4. You're certainly invited. All right, so our final thing to do today, first of all, to thank all of you for being such a great audience, and for all of our participants who were so helpful in answering all the questions.